Hi there, folks. This is Tony for the Minute to Midnight Show. I have with me today Alex Newman, frequent guest on the Minute to Midnight Show. I'm sure, Alex, you don't really need any introduction. I was just quickly talking to you off air. You know, you've got this hurricane situation in the US at the moment. And how has it affected you?
Yeah, well, I'm grateful that thankfully it didn't affect us too badly. We were maybe 60, 70 miles away from where the real devastation was. So we had, 50-mile-an-hour winds. We had some tree branches fall down, but and there was some flooding. Some people lost their homes in our county, but it wasn't anything like what the folks over in the Big Bend area saw. And certainly what they're dealing with right now in western North Carolina is just absolutely catastrophic. I mean, whole cities wiped off the map, towns washed down the river. So say a prayer for the folks dealing with all that. It's tough. They will rebuild. We get hit by hurricanes pretty regularly here in Florida. We've lived through quite a bunch of them, and it comes with the territory. If you want to live in a free state with a lot of nice beaches and a lot of freedom, there's things that you have to deal with, like hurricanes and mosquitoes. So, but we will rebuild. And in the meantime, I hope people will pray for all those who lost their homes and even the people who lost family members. So,
yes, it certainly looks pretty bad from what I've seen, the news reports and stuff. Pretty crazy. Yes, hurricanes. I don't know. When I think Florida in those areas, I think extreme heat and humidity and hurricanes. It's like, I don't know. Don't know if I want to live there.
Yeah, it's true. It's been an issue with Florida from the very beginning, right? It's one of the reasons why Florida was so slow to be settled. It's a difficult environment to live in if you don't have air conditioning, if you don't have the comforts of modern life. In fact, as they were building the roads down to like the islands and the Florida Keys, huge numbers of people were wiped off into the ocean by hurricanes, never to be heard from again. Actually, a couple of weeks ago, I was in the Bahamas, a country very close to Florida, and they got hit by a Category 5 in 2019, and it was still, unbelievable, the devastation. So it is one of the perils. The Californians, they have earthquakes and tyranny. We have hurricanes and mosquitoes. It's, when you live in a fallen world and you got the curse going on, it's always going to be stuff like that we got to deal with. So
yeah, okay. So you're talking about the fallen world and the curse. Well, I see the United Nations as a bit of a curse. So you got to the meetings at the UN recently. You want to fill us in?
Sure, thank
you. For
you.
the future and so on.
Yeah, so I went up there with my colleague, Andrew Muller. He's the chief of operations at Liberty Sentinel, and he also writes for The New American, as I do. I serve as senior editor there. And so we went to the UN Summit of the Future. We got there, and we got there on the equinox, actually. It was the day that they approved the Pact for the Future, the first day of the Summit for the Future. And I'm sure that was just a coincidence. No, actually, I'm not sure. I suspect it was not a coincidence. But this was a really big deal. I don't know how much the media in New Zealand reported on it. I can tell you in the United States, there was very, very little said. Yeah. I suspect they know now that in the kind of the Anglo-Saxon countries, the English-speaking countries, people have had it up to here with the UN and the tyranny and the globalism and the, after what happened with the pandemic over the last few years. I don't think a lot of people are eager to take instructions from the UN or any of its agencies right now. So I think the policy was silence. But this was a very, very significant meeting. You had all kinds of world leaders. Obviously, Joe Biden showed up for the. It ran in parallel with the beginning of the UN General Assembly 79th session. And so you had kings, presidents, prime ministers, potentates, all the leaders of the big UN agencies there. And the final agreement that they adopted on that Sunday after 9 months of negotiating, it makes it very, very clear that they fully intend to turn the UN into a kind of global governing system. When it was founded, it was just, it's just about peace. We just don't want war. Now it's like, and education and the environment and the law and the business and agriculture and climate change and oceans and, you name it, the UN wants to regulate and control it. So the way they framed it was, we're moving from UN to UN 2.0. And the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, he had a tagline that I guess the communications folks must have liked so much, because they blew it up on big posters and big stickers. They said, we can't build a future for our grandchildren with a system built for our grandparents. In other words, time for radical transformation. Forget the wisdom of your forefathers. Forget the fact that so many of your forefathers fought and died so that you could be free today. We're going to build a new and improved world order. And basically, we're not going to tell you about it until it's in place. So that's kind of the impression that I got, Tony.
So, yeah, it's the General Assembly. It's not the Security Council or whatever. So, how much teeth does it actually have in practical? Looking at what I've seen of it, it looks pretty awful. But how much actual teeth, for implementation is it?
It is awful, and that's a very good question. And I don't think anybody actually has a clear answer on that, Tony, and I think that's by design. I think they want a lot of mystery. They want this to be shrouded in confusion. This is very deliberate because they're not calling it a treaty, right? A treaty would have very specific constitutional implications in the United States of America. When our government signs a treaty, that is considered to be part of what we call the supreme law of the land. So it is just as if our Congress had passed a law. And yet, a treaty has to be ratified by our U.S. Senate, the upper chamber of our legislature, and 2/3 of the senators have to approve of it before it can be ratified. And so what they've started doing in recent decades is passing treaties and calling them something else. Like the Paris Agreement was the Paris Agreement. It was originally going to be the International Pandemic Treaty. Then they changed it to the International Pandemic Accord because they realized, the U.S. Senate is never going to approve this. So the Pact for the Future, I reached out to a lot of people to find out kind of what others were thinking about this, people with some experience. One of the people I reached out to was Dr. Francis Boyle. He is a professor of international law at the University of Illinois. He was number one in his class at Harvard University College of Law in international law and UN law in particular. In fact, he taught that there. He has represented governments, nations, UN institutions within the international court system. And so I asked him, what does this mean? What is it? And he said, look, this is a treaty. Even though they're not calling it that, this is a treaty. It will be put into our systems of governance, starting as soft law. Eventually, it will get teeth. And it needs to be recognized and understood as a treaty. I reached out to Congressman Mike McCall, who's the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee for the U.S. House of Representatives, and he said this is non-binding, right? So he said it was a bad idea, terrible, advances left-wing priorities, doesn't do anything about the CCP influence in the UN, but he said it's non-binding. So that is, I think, the thinking of a lot of people as well. This isn't that important because it's non-binding. Well, even a lot of the things that are technically non-binding are already being implemented, either through court rulings or through executive agencies. So I'll give you the example of what happened in Paris. I was in Paris at the UN Climate Summit, and the United Nations adopted the Paris Agreement. And Barack Obama started calling this an executive agreement, which, of course, there's no such thing as an executive agreement in our Constitution. That's not an actual category of legal instrument. But what he said was, well, we don't need Senate ratification for that because it's an executive agreement. And so when he got back to the United States after making all these crazy pledges to the UN that we're going to slash American energy by 30% in 15 years, he started implementing that without help from Congress, just using executive branch agencies. So he had the EPA draft new regulations to shut down power plants. He had the Department of Transportation draft new regulations to regulate automobile manufacturers and gas mileage that cars had to get. So he implemented it all as if it were a treaty without ever having submitted it for ratification as a treaty. So I think one of the really important things that this does, though, that everybody agrees, on the range of treaty to non-binding agreement, is it lays the legal foundation for a whole bunch of future power grabs. And I'll give you a very clear example, Tony, that I think everybody needs to understand. In April of last year, I wrote a major article when I read the policy brief number 2 of Secretary General Antonio Guterres, part of the Our Common Future series of policy briefs. These were basically the ideas that they wanted to enshrine in the Pact for the Future. So policy brief number 2 was about emergencies. It was the emergencies global protocols. And I want to read a couple of things about what actually made it into the final text of the Summit for the Future, and also what came out of that policy brief. So what actually ended up in the agreement, it's in action item number 54, was this. We recognize the need for a more coherent, cooperative, coordinated, and multidimensional international response to complex global shocks and the central role of the United Nations in this regard. The same element called for Guterres to develop new and improved ways to, and I'm quoting, strengthen the United Nations system response to global shocks. So that's kind of a watered down version of what was in the policy brief that actually underpins this. And so to understand it, you have to go back to that policy brief. And I want to read a couple of things from there, because this is so significant. In essence, it sets up the Secretary General as a dictator of the world in the event that he, at his sole discretion, without even consulting advisors, declares to be a global emergency. So in this global emergency platform, here's one of the key things about it. It says that when these things are triggered, regardless of the type or nature of the crisis involved, all stakeholders, and they referenced them earlier, governments, nations, international institutions, businesses, religious organizations, and I'm quoting here, must recognize the primary role of intergovernmental organs, we're talking about UN agencies here, in decision making. In other words, who's going to be the primary decision maker in the event that the Secretary General declares a global emergency? The United Nations and the UN's agencies. And so what constitutes a global emergency? Well, according to the policy brief, whatever the Secretary General says, but they give some examples: climate change, environment, economic, war, conflict, something going on in outer space, which they don't define, but I wonder if they're talking about asteroids or some alien fraud. I don't know what they're cooking up on that, but I'm sure it's not good. Then they have, black swan events that we can't foresee. So we don't even know what it might be, but we'll still need that power. It could be pretty much anything. And they also say it doesn't even have to be global. It could be a regional issue that we're going to declare a complex global emergency. So that's what was incorporated into this Pact for the Future. And what it does now, in the event of a future global emergency, which there's always emergencies, they're always going to come up with something, the Secretary General will come up with the response and say, hey, the nations of the world gave me a mandate to do this. Go read the Pact for the Future. All 193 UN member states agreed that I need to develop stronger global responses to complex global shocks. This is a complex global shock, so I'm just doing what the nations of the world asked me to do. And so this is very, very powerful. It will be used, I guarantee it. And it is just one of many areas, Tony, that are covered under this Pact for the Future.
So what else is in there? That sounds pretty bad. That particularly jumps out at you. And what about like things to do with re-educating the rest of the population?
Well, education is actually one of the most commonly featured themes in this entire document. It's mentioned dozens of times in this thing. And it's they use language that I think for a normal person doesn't sound all that alarming. Like over and over again throughout this document, they say that we need equitable access to quality education for all children. And a normal person who hasn't thought much about this think, well, I want all children to have access to an equitable quality education. What you're not thinking about is, what does quality education mean? Who's going to decide what a quality education is? And I can tell you, that's going to be the United Nations. That's going to be UNESCO. That's going to be the governments of the world. And they have a very different vision of education than, say, the Bible presents, right? The Bible tells us the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. The Bible tells us the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. These are in Proverbs 1:7, Proverbs 9:10. The UN says, I forget the fear of the Lord. You need to know DEI and CRT and transgenderism and global citizen. And they say this, global citizenship, gender equality, which in UN speak is, radical feminism. You need to know sustainable development. You need to know human rights, which in the UN lexicon is really quite the opposite of what we mean in America, God-given rights. So this is a setup for total takeover of education around the world. And they say over and over again, all children, right? There's no exception for homeschool children, for children in private schools. They have said repeatedly in the Jomtien Declaration, in the Dakar Framework, in Agenda 21, in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the Sustainable Development Goals, over and over again, they say all children need to learn from the same standards, the same global standards. And they also tell you that this education must change the attitudes, values, beliefs, and behaviors of your children. So they're working on this very rapidly. We've talked before on your program, Tony, about the World Core Curriculum. This was written by Assistant Secretary General Robert Mueller. He's called the father of global education. They said it should be taught to every child in every school in every country. And not so fun fact, it was written by Robert Mueller, who admitted in the foreword to the teacher's manual that it's based on the teachings of Alice Bailey and the Tibetan teacher Jwal Khul. And you know, Tony, Alice Bailey was the founder of the Lucifer Publishing Company, and the Tibetan teacher was a demon that she was communicating with that she called an ascended master. So bad idea. My idea of quality education doesn't involve Alice Bailey or ascended masters or anything of the sort, but that's what the UN means when they say all children are going to have a quality education.
Yes, okay, that's pretty ominous again. And obviously, all the things like you mentioned, climate change and sustainable development and all that, for right at the front of the UN's goals, and basically re-educating all of us to accept a different world. Like getting rid of the fossil fuels and putting us into this supposed, sustainable power generation and all of that sort of thing. So the average person, they're not going to want us dissenting from their views. So how do you see them trying to sway the masses into basically following the UN dictates?
Well, this was actually one of the major topics of this whole summit. The overarching theme, they said, was information integrity. Now, along with the Pact for the Future, they attached two other documents as annexes to that and adopted them by consensus through the General Assembly. The one was the Global Digital Compact. The other was the Declaration on Future Generations, which, it's all for the children. Everything we're doing, all the tyranny is necessary for future generations. But the Global Digital Compact enshrines this concept of information integrity into this international instrument. And you don't have to speculate about what that actually means. Again, they are very, very clear about what it means. And so I'll read you a couple of excerpts from that so people can understand where they're going with this. They talk about, for example, misinformation and disinformation. So it says we need internet governance run by a global multi-stakeholder system. And it says all governments and the UN must combat hate speech, discrimination, misinformation, and disinformation. And so let's break those down again, because the UN uses words in a way that doesn't make sense to normal people. When they say hate speech, they want you to think of somebody saying, like, we should kill the Jews or we should kill the Muslims. That's not what they mean by hate speech, okay? Hate speech was introduced to the UN lexicon by the Soviet Union, by a mass murdering dictatorship to classify all speech that it hated, Christian speech in particular. Anything that was considered anti-Soviet, right? If you said the Soviet Union is a ruthless dictatorship, that would be hate speech. You're stirring up hatred against the Soviets, right? Same thing they do now with China. If you speak out against the CCP, that's hate speech against China. No, it's not. Nothing to do with China. The people of China are victims of this murderous regime. And to take it one step further, and you and I have talked a little bit about this before also, Tony, eventually Christianity is what's got the bullseye on its back. If you look at Sweden, which is kind of 10, 20 years ahead of most of the rest of the Western world in the path to lunacy, the path to hell, they actually investigated the Bible back in 2008, their Justice Ombudsman, and he released a report concluding that the Bible was, in fact, a violation of Swedish hate speech laws. They did say it probably wasn't practical to ban it at this moment. People might get mad. Yeah, you imagine. But yes, the Bible is a violation of Swedish hate speech law. And they said the solution could be we can just change some of the words around, right? We don't have to have that harsh language about, marriage and gender and sexuality. We just remove that stuff. And we've seen this in the United Kingdom. We've seen street preachers hauled off to jail for quoting the Bible on issues like marriage and gender. So when you talk about mass immigration, if you speak out against that, that's considered hate speech. So when they talk about misinformation and disinformation, and we saw this very clearly, and I don't want to mess up the YouTube for you, but we saw what the WHO did, right? During the beginning, they said, hey, this thing is not transmissible among people. It was totally wrong. And yet anything contrary to that was considered by the big tech companies to be misinformation. They said it didn't come out of a lab in China. It came out of a bat from a Wuhan market. Anything contrary to that was misinformation. Well, now we know they were totally wrong about that. So basically, misinformation and disinformation is anything that runs counter to their narrative, and they're promising censorship. So the UN actually started a partnership with Google. They announced it in 2022. Melissa Fleming, Undersecretary General of the UN for Communications, announced this publicly at a World Economic Forum event. And I found Melissa Fleming at this meeting, and I asked her, Melissa, can you please tell us about the formula that you and Google are using to determine what information needs to be suppressed, what you need to protect people from, and what information people can access? And we put the video out. Oh, well, who are you? I don't recognize you. I can't talk to you. And she goes away and she starts talking to other reporters. Why? My question was perfectly innocent. I went through 50 background checks to be able to get in there. They knew I'm not, some dangerous individual. I'm just a journalist. Why wouldn't she answer the question? Because they know that if Americans, if New Zealanders figured out what they mean, which is a global censorship regime, they would be appalled and they would demand a stop to it.
Yes. Well, that's a nasty looking picture. Who else did you get to catch up with at the meeting that perhaps you have some interesting stories about, like that one?
We talked to a lot of people. We confronted the with real questions the Secretary General's spokesman, Stefan Jurek. There's been a lot of criticism about this in America. We've had members of Congress come out and say this is a power grab. It's stealing our sovereignty. We've had over half of our nation's governors say we're not going to obey the UN on issues of healthcare or anything else. So I asked him about this, and he said, "Oh, we're not creating a world government here. This is just nations working together. And read the documents for yourself." And I will echo his recommendation: read the documents for yourself and decide for yourself what they're really doing. But he insisted that this was not an effort to undermine sovereignty. This is just a totally innocent pact for the future. We confronted the head of the World Bank and asked him some questions, and the Prime Minister of Denmark. Right? They also. The economy needs the government to do investments. I mean, where would we be without the government? I mean, we wouldn't have internet and GPS, which of course is totally fraudulent. So we confronted a lot of these people. We confronted the head of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, asked her about the Bill Gates Franken mosquitoes that they're releasing around the world, the genetic engineering of our crops and our livestock. And, we're going to have a discussion about that and, biosafety. And so, not a lot of people there wanted to talk. We ran into pro-abortion zealots, but they really had a tight leash on the media. I've never actually seen such strict controls on journalists. And it unfortunately, it wasn't just us. We talked to a major journalist for a public broadcaster in a major Western country. I won't give away her name because she didn't give permission, but even she was appalled at the way that journalists were being treated by the UN police and by the guardians of this thing. She said she was interviewing one of the youth delegates about what they want for the future, and the UN police came up and barked orders at her and said, "You're not allowed to film here. Get out of here. You can't interview this guy." And so we had to have minders as we were going around big parts of the facility, and 2 out of our 3 minders were actually Communist Chinese. So very, very interesting that was our assigned person. But I hope people realize that these are the people who are plotting your future right now. You ought to pay attention.
And what's even more concerning is that each country sends their politicians there, and whether they read the documents or they just have a cup of coffee and just sign this piece of paper, I don't know with some of them, but they're selling us out. Every country, whoever is in power or being put in power, goes to these UN meetings and then basically signs their country away.
Yeah, that's right. And, this was approved by consensus. There were some really interesting things that happened there. In the run-up to the adoption of this thing, the Russian government, which, of course, people who know me know I am no apologist for Vladimir Putin, but they submitted an amendment to this pact saying the UN shall not interfere in the domestic affairs of any nation. Right. And, you'd think that'd be a no-brainer, especially based on what the spokesman for the Secretary General told me. Oh, it's not a world government. Right? And that was voted down overwhelmingly. 7 governments voted in favor, 140-something voted against. And so that amendment was thrown out. Now, when it came time for approving this thing by consensus, not one government stopped this thing. But there were some that expressed concerns, in particular, the Javier Milei administration in Argentina. After it was adopted, they could have stopped it being approved by consensus. They didn't. But after that, their foreign minister actually put out a statement saying we're going to distance ourselves from this thing. It's not in line with our views on freedom and how we plan to develop. So we're officially distancing ourselves from that, and we're not going to be implementing it in our country, which I was very thankful for them speaking out like that. But I wish some government would, and there are many governments. I mean, we've dealt with governments where we know the prime ministers know better. Why not just raise your hand and say, hey, I object to this thing. This isn't in line with what our people believe. I think they're all scared. They know that if they do that, the Communist Chinese, the U.S. government, the European Union, they're all going to come down on you like a ton of bricks and say, oh, you hate poor people, you hate gender equality, you hate whatever, you hate peace. And so they're all scared to resist this. But it was a very sad spectacle.
Yeah, I bet it was. And I know in the language they were talking about ending wars and stuff, and just I know it's off track from it, but, you know, you're looking at the situation in the Middle East at the moment, and that seems to be escalating into potentially a much bigger, more far-reaching conflict as well. So it's not a pretty picture.
Yeah, it's not. And, it was interesting when Netanyahu got up to speak, a ton of delegates walked out of the room. I mean, a lot of Arab delegates, Islamic delegates, they just got up and walked out. And it's fascinating because all this talk about human rights and, oh, we love human rights, and somehow, a mass murderer who's got millions of people in re-education camps, who's literally chopping out body organs from political and religious dissidents, gets up and everybody applauds like trained SEALs. But then Netanyahu gets up and they act like, oh, wow, is the reincarnation of Adolf Hitler. We all got to go. It really is a sight to behold. And the bias against Israel was astounding. We sat in on a press conference by the spokesman for the Secretary General, and the whole first 10 minutes maybe was all about the wicked Jews and how dare they shoot a hospital or a school. No mention of the fact that Hamas fighters are hiding in the schools and in the hospital. They can't talk about that. They talked about how the Israeli Defense Forces had shut down the operations of Al Jazeera, which calls itself a news outlet, but really is an extension of the Islamic regime in Qatar. Why? Why the bias? Why is it that a lot of these UN agencies, 95% of their resolutions against a particular country are against Israel? Why? I mean, even if you don't like Israel, even if you think Israel's government is not behaving the way it should, do we really believe that 95% of the atrocities in the world today are committed by this tiny little government on a tiny little speck of land? What about China? What about North Korea? What about Iran? It defies explanation. It is truly incredible, Tony, but it tells you a lot, I think, about the character of the UN and the member states.
And who's controlling it ultimately.
Yep.
Yeah, that is crazy. And like you say, there's all these other dictatorships with, like North Korea you mentioned. I mean, that's astounding, the level of human rights abuse there, and yet you don't get every country standing up and condemning North Korea.
That's right. Yep. Where the barbarism is incomprehensible. Okay. And I mean, that's really, people need to let that sink in. And it's similar with the United States, right? The United States is constantly being demonized. Not right now because Joe Biden is president and he's basically doing everything he can to sell us out. But when Donald Trump was there, I mean, the U.S. was target numero uno for 4 years while Donald Trump was the president of the United States. And why is the United States really the worst, most wicked country in the world? Are we operating concentration camps where we're taking parents out of their homes and brainwashing them and torturing them? I mean, it's just wicked. And I think it also tells you something really important about this concept of human rights, because you read this Pact for the Future and over again, human rights, all this lip service to human rights. How could the dictatorship in North Korea or the dictatorship in Beijing or the dictatorship in Iran sign on to a document that enshrines human rights? Well, it gets to a very important element of what the UN actually is. Human rights, when it comes to the United Nations, are really the inversion of what the founders of the United States understood to be human rights. Right? In our Declaration of Independence, our founding fathers who created our country said we hold these truths to be self-evident, that God created us equally and that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights: life, liberty, property. And these are just biblical ideas. God said, "Thou shalt not murder," so you have a right to life. God said, "Don't steal," you got a right to property. Very simple. And the key point here is these rights supersede government. They don't come from government. So government, actually, it says in the Declaration, exists to protect those rights. But when you read, for example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is enshrined all over this Pact for the Future, Your rights come from government. Your rights come from the UN. Your rights come from instruments like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and they can be limited for public order, for morality, for whatever. Article 29 says none of these rights and freedoms shall be used contrary to the purposes and principles of the UN. In other words, you have no rights if you choose to use them to speak out against or resist the UN's evil agenda. So it's a total inversion of the concept of rights. And it becomes so clear when you look at the member states and how they all applaud this idea of human rights that they're not talking about the same thing that we traditionally, in what was known as Christendom, have known.
Yeah, okay. So the average person who's being, railroaded down this track with no control, and most of them don't even know there is a pact for the future, that they're more interested in whatever, taking selfies or playing some sort of game on their phone or whatever. So most people haven't got a clue. But for those people that do kind of know what's going on here and feel powerless, but what advice would you give those people at this point? Like, what do we actually do from a practical standpoint?
Well, there's a lot that we can do. I would start with, just on an individual level, be in prayer and read your Bibles. Right. All I could think about as this thing was going on was Psalm 2, where you have the kings of the earth. This is 3,000 years ago, written by David. The kings of the earth and the rulers taking counsel together against the Lord and his anointed one. And of course, God laughs at them, and God ridicules them, and he will speak to them in his wrath, coming very soon. And so keep that in mind, right? Read your Bible and understand that what's going on here is much bigger than just what you see on your TV. This is a spiritual war that we are watching, that if you're a Christian, you are participating in, right? You have been enlisted into the ranks of the forces of Jesus Christ. And that has a very specific meaning. Go back and read Ephesians chapter 6 to understand kind of where we're supposed to be at in our walk with the Lord when it comes to the manifestation of all this evil. And then I think in a concrete way, we do need to take certain actions to protect ourselves, to protect our families, especially our children, from this wicked agenda. When the UN talks about taking over education and teaching our kids all these blasphemous, horrific, ungodly, unbiblical ideas, our response as parents is no, right? Go read the words of Jesus when he talks about taxes, right? Whose image is on this coin? Oh, yeah, Caesar's image is on the coin. So give to Caesar what is Caesar's. Whose image is on your children? God's image. So your children belong to God. So no, UN, sorry, you don't get our children. That's not something that's negotiable. We will not accept that. And then on a political level, I do think it's important that, especially we who live in countries that are ostensibly self-governing, where ostensibly we have democracy, where the government is supposed to be doing what the people say, it's important that we tell our elected officials that we are not okay with this. So I'm very pleased with the resistance that we're seeing in the United States right now. I mentioned half of our nation's governors have said we're not going to obey the UN on these things. We've got bills in both houses of our Congress to get us out of the UN. We've got counties passing resolutions that we're not going to obey all of this lawlessness in our counties. We're not going to allow that to be imposed on our counties. We've got states passing laws saying we will not obey the UN or the World Health Organization or any of their agencies on any of these issues. We need to all be doing that. If you live in a parliamentary system, call up your member of parliament and say, hey, what are you doing to protect us from these wicked ideas? If you live in the United States, call up your congressman, call up your senators, call up your state representative and your state senator, call up your sheriff and tell them, hey, where do they get off doing this stuff? Are you going to allow this to be imposed on the people of Florida or Oklahoma or California? And if the answer is yes, I intend to allow that to happen, then you need to start looking for somebody else to represent you there, because that is wrong. It's unconstitutional. And even more importantly, it's unbiblical. So I think we need to make our voices heard. We need to rebuke and expose evil. We've talked about this before, Tony. The body of Christ is one body, but it has many members. So everybody's going to have their own function, their own role in this battle. Me as a journalist, I like to reprove and expose, as Paul says in Ephesians 5:11. Have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them, expose them. Other people are going to be in different areas, right? Maybe you're an educator. Make sure you're protecting the students in your classroom from this evil, ultimately antichrist propaganda. Maybe you're in finance. Make sure your business is not advertising with wicked companies that are promoting this evil agenda to the population of your country. So we all have a assignment. We all have a role to play however small it may be. And if we're to do all things, including eating and drinking as unto the Lord, how much more our political, our business, our family, our decisions that actually impact every area of our lives, how much more should they be submitted to Christ and his rule? So I would just urge people to be in prayer about this, read their Bible, and then figure out where you fit in and how you can respond to this in a biblical way.
Sounds good. So where do people find you online and, your writings and so forth? And you mentioned some videos that you did at the UN. So where can people find all that?
So most of our coverage of the UN Summit of the Future is going to be at thenewamerican.com. And people can find that at thenewamerican.com. I don't know how hard it is to get the print magazine in New Zealand. We do a print magazine that goes out in the United States and some people in Canada. But most of our stuff is online, so people can find that there. The videos are on our Rumble channel. They're on the website. They're also on my X feed, so AlexNewman_JOU. A lot of my other stuff is available through my own website, libertysentinel.org. Sentinel is SENTINEL. People can sign up for our free newsletter there. And then, of course, I'm a pretty regular guest on your program, Tony, so people can keep watching and subscribe here. And I come on pretty frequently, and I thank you for the opportunity to do that.
Oh, it's always amazing to have you on because we get treated to a lot that we wouldn't hear anywhere else because you're actually right there on the ground in these places like the UN. So it's priceless to have this information that you bring. So I want to say a huge thank you for being on the A Minute to Midnight show again, Alex. And let's hope we can continue to do this for a good long time before the UN censorship shuts us all down.
Amen. Hey, thank you so much, Tony. I appreciate it. God bless you. And thanks again for having me on.
God bless you too. And thank you for being on. Folks, please make sure you are subscribed to A Minute to Midnight as well on our various platforms, and particularly our website, aminutetomidnight.com. And also, we do run it 100% by donations. And at this point, folks, it would be great if you're able to help us out. We could really do with it. We can't run it without your help. And here are a few reasons, could do with it, particularly at the moment. So we thank you for the folks that do donate to A Minute to Midnight. And if anyone else wants to help out, you can do that at our website, aminutetomidnight.com. And all the music that we use, I have written, played and recorded as well. God bless, and God willing, we'll be back with another video in a few days' time.